Well, good evening to everyone. I'm Jack Knott, Dean of the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development at New York University, and I'm also the Gale and Ira Drukier Dean's Chair. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's Constitution Day 2022 program hosted by the NYU John Brademas Center, named and inspired after its founder, former Congressman and NYU President Emeritus, John Brademas, and the NYU Steinhardt Verbatim Performance Lab, a project of NYU Steinhardt's program in educational theater, which is led by Director Joe Salvatore and Associate Director Keith Huff. We also thank our partner, Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network at NYU Law. Constitution Day is celebrated annually in September, usually September 17, to commemorate the day in 1787 when the delegates for the Constitutional Convention ratified the Constitution in Pennsylvania. By congressional mandate led by Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia in 2004, all nonprofit educational institutions, including universities, are required to present programming focused on the Constitution. The mission of the Brademas Center, as co-host of tonight's program, is to engage people in programming pertaining to the issues of utmost importance to Brademas's life: education, culture, art, and humanities, global outreach, and the legislative process. The Verbatim Performance Lab seeks to recreate speeches and dialogue on important social and political issues, and tonight's program will feature live performances by students engaged in the lab's newest project. The performances will be intertwined with discussions between Dr. Karen Jackson-Weaver, NYU Senior Associate Vice President for Global Faculty Engagement and Innovation in the Office of Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Strategic Innovation, and Jennifer Weiss-Wolf, the new Executive Director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network, and myself. Before we begin, I'd like to turn the program over to the creator and lead behind the performances, Joe Salvatore, Director of the Verbatim Performance Lab, Clinical Professor of Educational Theater, and Vice Chair for Academic Affairs in the Steinhardt Department of Music and Performing Arts Professions, who will provide more detail on the background of the performance pieces chosen for tonight's program. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Dean Knott. It's great to collaborate again on this Constitution Day celebration. And this year, we're excited to be joining you live from the NYU TV studio here on the Washington Square campus. One of the ways that we research and create new work in the Verbatim Performance Lab is through interviewing people about a particular topic and then investigating and performing their responses word for word. Through our investigations and performances, we aim to disrupt assumptions, biases, and intolerances across the spectrum of political, cultural, and social narratives. Given the Supreme Court's overturning of the Roe decision earlier this year, we've been thinking about the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution and how its phrase equal protection of the laws has been interpreted, debated, and litigated. This evening's performance is called If Just the Rights of People Were Considered. It features 10 NYU students performing excerpts from interviews from our Portraits US Polarization project. Over the past year, our research team, that includes many NYU students, has conducted over 100 interviews about political polarization with participants from across the country. The culmination of this project will premiere as a performance at NYU Steinhardt on October 20th, but tonight we're bringing you a small sample of what we've heard and learned through our investigations so far. We hope you'll attend our full performance next month. The excerpts you'll hear this evening were selected because we believe they demonstrate a diversity of viewpoints on topics that have been important touchstones this year. We've put these viewpoints in conversation with each other, even though all of our participants were interviewed separately. We're interested to learn how you respond to these conversations and how you feel they relate to the 14th Amendment. Our performance unfolds in 4 scenes, and following each scene, Dean Knott and our respondents will share some of their observations and insights before we move on to the next scene. For each of the 10 excerpts, we cast the actors across identity to portray a person of a different race, gender, gender identity, age, and/or political affiliation than they are. This allows the actor to investigate and potentially empathize with the lived experience of another, and we're also interested in how it affects your experiences as audience members. As you're watching this evening, we encourage you to notice how you respond to each of the 10 participants as you experience their words delivered by actors with different identities. Our actors this evening in the order that they appear are Avril Carr, Michael Roberts, Ran Zhu, Topaz Go, Beth Weiss, Devin Joyner, Daniel Tuttle, Jessamine Fitzpatrick, Kayla Matters, and Noah Jackson. Thanks again to the John Brademas Center, Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network at NYU Law, NYU Votes, and NYU TV for supporting and sponsoring this event. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. We'll now segue into our performance of If Just the Rights of People Were Considered. The title of our first scene is All the Tricks in the Playbook.
This is the transcript of Hannah.
And this is the transcript of Julie Iyer.
And I think that our founders were really worried about this precise thing happening, which is why they instituted so many of the checks and balances that they did. But it's really hard 250 years on to predict all the tricks in the playbook that someone will attempt, or to stop someone from playing the long game, and to having a 20 and 30-year plan to do this progressively through gerrymandering and through stacking of the Supreme Court, by delaying rightful nominees the chance to even be heard, by shutting down legislation before it even gets out of committee because they simply don't want to discuss it. Doing all these things, not to mention executive orders and so many other tools that have been used nefariously, I don't think that even a system of checks and balances can protect against everything. Nonetheless, one written 200 years ago.
Yes, just the right to vote, and everyone, like the whole like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are in the Declaration of Independence, right? Like that's what this whole country was founded on, was that document essentially. Not really, but like essentially, right? That was the first doctrine of what we're supposed to be doing. And then like all the freedoms of the Constitution, like those are the things that we are supposedly supposed to be aiming towards. And then we just live in a system that's essentially trying to dismantle all of that, right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Like you don't have time to pursue your happiness if you're working 5 part-time jobs just to, pay your rent. And, liberty, like they're trying to take away the right to vote, right? Life, like we don't even have free health insurance. Like people are, and look at this whole pandemic, like almost 1 million people died, right? Like what, right? Where are the rights that we found,
I think the intention was there, but I can understand how it falls short. I mean, you could say the same thing about the Second Amendment. Yes, fundamentally, there should be I'm not against the idea that the founding members of the nation, I don't want to say, I hate the word fathers because they weren't just fathers, obviously, but the founders of this nation were thinking about the individual's ability to defend themselves, but they were thinking about that with this weaponry that was 200 years outdated from what we see today. There's only so much mayhem you could cause in a mall with a musket.
So those are the things we're supposed to be preserving, right? And like all the things in the Constitution, and we have like half of the Congress is just like, we're going to ignore all of this and we're just going to use, I'm sorry, I have to take the pizza out of the oven. I live in a small apartment. It's okay. All right. Yeah, you have half of the country just using these buzzwords and these fear-mongering words of like, like pro-life. And it's like, no, you're not pro-life, you're a pro-fetus, or like, we have to ban critical race theory. And like that, none of that not even, you're just trying to ban American history, facts. Like critical race theory is like an advanced like class you take in like law school. It's not, like it's So I think I lost, you saw where I was trying to go. I lost the point somewhere when I had to get the pizza, but you know.
All right. Thank you to our performers for getting us underway with these important issues. A lot of what we're focusing on this evening is around the 14th Amendment. And so I wanted to start out with a couple basic questions. One is, what is the 14th Amendment? And what are some landmark Supreme Court cases associated with it? And I don't know who would like to start, but.
I'm happy to jump in just on the pizza there, because I think that the pizza in the oven, it ties almost exactly to the kind of liberties that we are talking about when the question of substantive due process within the 14th Amendment and what it means to live one's life. You know, we'll get lost often in constitutional doctrine and big sky, blue sky ideas, but when it comes down to it, substantive due process and the right to live one's life is really, really important. So I just wanted to say that the pizza piece of it is so important to that entire extraordinary exchange. So I'm going to turn it back to Karen, but I just wanted to say that about the pizza.
No, I love that. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, Dean Knott, for having us. It's exciting to be with you all this evening. And I think it's so important and so timely to really understand the Constitution in a contemporary context. And I think our actors did a phenomenal job of really debating, discussing, and helping us to really understand and underscore how we have these conversations. I do want to go a little bit into how we think about the 14th Amendment. Now, I'm not a constitutional scholar or a legal expert, but I am a historian. And so I love to go to the original documents. I have my Constitution here. It may be a little hard to see because my background is blurred because the lighting is a little weird here in my office, but I keep a copy of the Constitution with me in my office, and I like to have it. So when I have these conversations, I can go to the actual language. And the 14th Amendment really involves granting citizenship. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship. And the 15th Amendment gave men, not women at that time, the right to vote, right? But the 14th Amendment really, there's a part of it that talks about no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And it goes on to talk about equal protection of the laws. And I just raise this because I think the actors really highlighted what does it mean when we think about citizenship, what comes along with life and liberty and all the things that we see that are illuminated in the 14th Amendment. How do we realize those constructs, those constitutional constructs in contemporary society? So wonderful way to help us, I think about it and really debate and have dialogue.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karen. I wanted to just add one thing to that, and that is, why did we even need a 14th Amendment if we have the 13th Amendment? If the former slaves have become free, why do we need a 14th Amendment? And that's, as I'm again not a constitutional scholar, but my understanding is it has to do partly with the 1857 Dred Scott case, in which it was the Supreme Court actually ruled that former slaves could not become citizens of the U.S. And so even though they were free, they couldn't have the same protections and same due process that whites had at that time. And therefore, in order to provide former slaves in particular, and also I think to some extent immigrants, the right to have equal protection of the law, have all the kinds of things that citizens have, it required an amendment to the Constitution in addition to the 13th Amendment. So people often forget that, but it's a striking, really striking history. All right. I don't know, I think we've used up our 5 minutes possibly. Did Karen or Jennifer, did you want to say just maybe one or a couple sentences on the role of the Supreme Court in this?
I actually just wanted to say a few other words of it, aside from pizza, about substantive due process and the way that the conversation, and it was apparent through the discourse that was drawn from Hannah and Julie about, where we're at today, especially, post-Dobbs. That was referred to in the opening remarks. There's a lot of public attention been paid to sort of the privacy rights and the evolution of those rights. And we had, thought about mentioning a few cases. So starting with, in the 1960s, in the Griswold versus Connecticut case that focused on contraception, all the way through, discourse around abortion, around marriage equality. And much of that is rooted in 14th Amendment privacy and individual liberty frames. And I think we'll see more discussion about that as the evening goes on.
Okay, great. Thank you both. So let's go to our next scene, which is features 3 actors that is entitled, I Would Rather You Just Be Honest.
This is the transcript of retired music vocal teacher.
And the transcript of Martha, 52-year-old Hispanic woman. And the transcript of Kumik.
It goes way beyond abortion. It goes way beyond that. Crazy enough, I started I haven't, it's been around for a few years, but Handmaid's Tale, I just started watching it and I'm like, how crazy is that? I don't know if you've seen it. But yeah, well, I'm only on like the 4th, 5th episode, but to think, it's not so far-fetched to think about that now in how the world is going, where the United States is going.
The only thing I'll just speak on is the whole pro-choice thing. I think I'm tired of people using laws and politics to control people. I think laws should be there to protect people, right? Yeah, we don't want murderers on the street, we don't want whatever, we don't want you to whatever, but I think more and more I see that just it becoming a free-for-all. Right, that now you don't want laws imposed upon you that you don't like, but you want to impose these laws on everybody else because you don't agree with pro-choice or the fact that we should get background checks for guns or whatever, pick a topic from the Democratic list of things.
I mean, the conservatives are to me very scary people, and not saying all of them are, but that fringe that what's her name? Taylor Greene. What's her name? First name? I can't think of her name, but she's out of her mind, and it's just Marjorie Taylor Greene. That's her name.
Well, contrary to all of the arguing that's going on, the system is working. We had Roe versus Wade controlling that for how many years? But it never, because of the emotion, it never addressed the state issue of Roe versus state versus federal government issue. It didn't address that. And so it took how many years? Whatever that was. 60 years almost, I guess. I just feel like the imposition of your will on my rights is unacceptable. It bothers me. And I'll speak specifically to women. Men have tried to control women since the beginning of time. Using the Bible, using this other thing, and it's always been about control of women. It's never been about protecting women. It's about control. And when we can admit that and at least say, well, yeah, it's about control. If you said to me, yeah, we're passing this because we want to control women, I would actually respect you more than you try to say, we're protecting the unborn fetus. I'm like, you mean that can't survive on its own viably without, machines and whatever, and is a clump of cells? Okay, I would rather you just be honest about what you're saying. That just I'm trying to control you guys, and we get it. Let's just be honest about it versus the guise of all the other things. So in an effort to say I want to do something right. It would be nice if just the rights of people were considered. That's it.
But it seems as though when people are screaming about freedom and saying that their rights are being violated, on the conservative side, you're thinking, what are you talking about? It's your issues that are taking our freedoms away. It's not the people that are liberals or the Democrats. I just think it's really it's just scary. It is, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's I mean, I don't not sleep about it because I'm just me, and who do you know what I mean? Like, what exactly can I do? I mean, I've done some marches, that kind of thing, but I don't know if I'm worried for our country. I really am.
So it took 50 years to address it on that point. And so the system is working if you're willing to be patient with it. The argument we had around the dinner table is, being debated. We didn't shoot each other. We didn't beat each other up. We may not necessarily have been very nice when we're in our language, but it's being debated. There is a pause because with that being a state issue, and the ladies in Alaska are still covered under the same abortion laws if they were before that ruling was made. So to me, it's working like it is. It just sounds like it's not.
All right, thank you again, students. So enjoy these performances, they're powerful. I wanted to start out here with a question about Roe versus Wade. It was referred to. It's obviously, it seems like the Supreme Court ruled one way some years ago and now has ruled the other way. And it's related to how privacy is interpreted. And so I want to ask a question first about the notion of privacy. Where does that come from? Is it in the Constitution? And what does it have to do with the 14th Amendment?
And Jack, I'll jump in here because there was something I was going to say earlier that the performance kind of alluded to, and this group of students also kind of hinted at it. And it was mentioned before when we were talking about the Constitution and we're talking about the 14th Amendment in particular. And what do we really think about the charge and the mission of the Supreme Court and how they interpret the Constitution? And for me, this gets to the privacy issue.
I asked that earlier, but we didn't get to it. So I'm glad you're swinging back to it.
Oh, sure. Because I think for me to really unpack the meaning of privacy, we have to go back to the question that you raised about interpretation. And I think in many ways, there really isn't much discussion or debate, or let me say it this way, we may not really debate much around the idea of interpretation, right? Interpretation is how one sees things, how you investigate it, how you apply it, and so on and so forth. But here's the thing, how we interpret the law, how we interpret the 14th Amendment, and where we were in terms of Roe v. Wade 50 years ago and where we are now, we have a different interpretation. Individuals of the Supreme Court who have different interpretations of what that meaning should be. And the way I like to kind of frame it or think about it is, if you're driving in a car and you see a yellow light, there's some people, you're normally taught that yellow means caution, to slow down. But I see both Jack and Jennifer smiling because we know some people speed up, right? It's like, okay, the light just turned, it's green, it's turning yellow, and I'm going to see if I can make it.
I'm not admitting my behavior here.
No. So, and we all may be guilty of that time to time, but I think the point that I'm making is this interpretation framework or praxis and how we can take something that it's the same, it's the yellow light, it's the 14th Amendment. And I don't want to in any way say that they're synonymous, but my point is that oftentimes we take a concept or an idea, and there's this large spectrum or span of thought on how it can be interpreted. And I think because we have a Supreme Court that has the ideology around how we interpret the 14th Amendment and how we have now, in this contemporary context, gotten to the the overturning of Roe v. Wade and what it means in terms of privacy. I think for many people, the notion of privacy meant that women would be able to have autonomy and the ability to make decisions for themselves. And I think what has happened over time is that privacy has become politicized, right? And so when we talk about, and then the students did a great job of kind of the buzzwords, pro-choice, pro-life, conservative, progressives. This kind of language is really politicized, right? And instead of us really kind of looking at what is best for the citizenry, what is best for women, we fall into these ways of thinking about these ideas and concepts that in many ways have become politicized instead of it being a health issue or an issue that really promotes what's best for the citizenry.
Good. Jennifer, did you want to add anything to this particular question?
No, keep going with your questions. That was really extraordinary.
The only thing I wanted to add about privacy is it's actually not in the Constitution, the right to privacy. And it's implied by the Constitution's mention of unreasonable search and seizure and the right to assembly, which then that's where this interpretation comes in. What is unreasonable? What is not? What does it apply to? What doesn't it? And so it's really an extension of some, it's not a, it doesn't say in the Constitution people have a right to privacy. It's an interpretation of something that's related, but not exactly the same. And that gives, this kind of wide range for interpretation, where you get a Supreme Court some years ago saying, yes, it clearly applies to women's rights to have a baby or not if they're pregnant. And then now people saying, no, it's not, that doesn't apply to that. The members of the Supreme Court anyway. One of the other things that came up in this discussion was about, and we see this being played out now, that the Supreme Court says, there isn't a right to this. The states then are acting on their own, passing laws. You can look at a map, you got Texas and so on passing laws, and then other states, California and New York, going in the opposite direction. So how does this 14th Amendment relate to states' rights and the federal government? How is it that the states get to now decide what's going to be legal in their state and not somebody else's state?
We're seeing some of the disingenuity of that argument by our elected politicians at the moment, who have not wasted much time introducing federal legislation. Senator Graham did this past week to outlaw abortion after 15 weeks nationwide. So I think most of the American public has a pretty cynical eye around the states' rights argument, especially considering what the trajectory looks to be in the Congress. So there's that political aspect of it, and I think that's really important because there's the amount of distrust and that the population has in the court itself as an institution right now is certainly related to that. But I would also say there's another disingenuous piece of it on the court's part, particularly in the Dobbs ruling, when they declared not only about abortion being a question to go back to the states, but affirming that the political process will serve all of us because we all have the opportunity to make our voices heard. And this is the same court that has been, gutting key aspects of democratic participation and engagement, whether it's through the Voting Rights Act and the Shelby County case in 2013, and other cases that have been heard and ruled upon in recent years, saying that redistricting and gerrymandering and all of these issues are things that are decided by, in state legislatures. We actually do have a reality right now that for all people, they do not have an equal opportunity to have their voices heard in the political process due to systemic barriers that the court itself is complicit in supporting and creating. So there's rightful cynicism about that.
Yeah, and there's, this issue of the states versus the federal government and the interpretation of even the Bill of Rights. Originally, when the Bill of Rights, those were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution in 1789. The Supreme Court ruled in 1833 that the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government, not to the states. And so this, right from the beginning, was an issue. And clearly, during Reconstruction, after the conflagration of the Civil War, there was an imposition of the federal government into the states. And, for example, the Ku Klux Klan was banned in 1871, but then with the removal of federal troops, later on in 1876, you got into this Jim Crow period, this horrible, it's called the progressive era, but it wasn't very progressive in some ways, especially with regard to race relations. And that's when you got the court interpreting things like it only, 14th Amendment only applies to government actions, and especially the federal government. And this allowed the states to have whites only signs and, segregation and things like that. And it took some decades, obviously, into the 20th century for that to swing back politically, Jennifer, as you're talking about, to interpreting this. No, wait a minute, the 14th Amendment does apply to the states, and they don't have the right to do this, and so on. So this whole issue of the tug of war between the states and the federal government has been politicized over the course of our history in fairly dramatic ways, and this is just one of the most recent examples. So, all right, shall we go on to scene number 3? Okay, so our third scene is called A Right to Choose.
This is the transcript of 30-something blonde female.
And the transcript of Alyssa.
And when COVID hit, I knew there would be a vaccine coming. And I was really scared because I didn't want that to be. I was afraid of the mandate. And unfortunately, that is exactly what played out. And so for me, when you ask me the question about rights, I have a medical exemption because of my injury when I was in my 20s, and both of my employers denied that exemption, and I lost my job.
Oh, okay. You know what? Let me think for a second. I wouldn't say, I don't know, but I would say my rights were completely violated, or like directly myself, but in general, like, I think that we should have a right to choose what happens to our bodies.
And I mean, I threw everything away when I quit my job to be an actor, because I was finally able to honor my authentic calling for the first time in my life. And I haven't been able to work at any theater. I haven't been able to enter restaurants. I can't go into my daughter's school. They won't let me in. So when we see, and this is just one topic that happens to be relevant today.
And so I would say, like, with the government having a lot of conversations about things like abortion and banning abortion and things like that, I think that that's not something that impacts me directly, because that's not something I'm dealing with directly, but it does impact women. And I think that just having conversations about what someone should do with their body is just not appropriate.
But when we create these very it's divisive, yes, it's segregation at a certain level, but it is polarizing people. And when people find out that I haven't taken the COVID shot, I'm immediately sort of thrown into this bucket that I'm selfish. I'm a Trump supporter. I'm like, God, it's just like my biggest, don't associate me, please. I'm so afraid of sharing the information because it puts you in a certain category that people are very divided and polarized on.
And I don't think it's right. I don't know that it necessarily violates our rights as given in the Constitution or something, but I do think it violates our rights as human beings to be able to do what we feel is best for our bodies. And in that, I think it would be hypocritical of me to not say that for other things, like, for example, like a vaccine mandate. I think that if I'm going to believe that you should have the right to have an abortion, and that's your choice, I think you should also have a right to get a vaccine or not, because I feel like if I didn't say that would be hypocritical of me.
All right, that definitely is an issue we're all facing right here at the university and across the country, and dividing us politically and every other way. My body, my choice, that was a rallying cry for the women's movement for many years, and clearly was one of the bases for supporting abortion and the right for a woman to choose to have an abortion. And now we're getting, as was represented in the little performance we just had, the same kind of argument about vaccine mandates. If it's my body, why should I be forced by the government or by New York University or some other institution to inject a vaccine into my body? So do you see these as congruent, as was discussed with the students' performance? And how does body autonomy really fit into the Constitution?
Jennifer, do you want to jump in? Or
yeah, I'm glad to jump in. And it's so interesting because as a lifelong advocate, I found it frustrating and ironic, as I saw those arguments rising during, the height of the pandemic and the introduction of vaccines. So I really enjoyed actually just hearing that discussion, hearing from those two individuals as they thought out loud about it. But really what I started thinking about, and it's not so much a constitutional question, but it's an organizing and advocacy perspective, is how truly limiting my body, my choice has always been as a rallying cry in the reproductive rights movement, and how it didn't fully include so much of the reproductive justice framework that is so critical as we think about what it means to support the social and economic and systemic constructs that lend themselves to being able to make those decisions and to be part of the full societal texture. I don't know how else to describe it really, but to me, actually, my body, my choice is quite limiting. So I'm not surprised to see it appropriated. And it doesn't really reflect, I think, the reproductive future that many in this in the movement aspire towards. And it's why the jurisprudence around privacy has always been quite limiting. People will frequently say that Roe was always a floor and not a ceiling, and it didn't ensure access to all who needed it. So my body, my choice became kind of a hollow rallying cry to some extent. So So hearing that discussion actually only underscores that for me. I don't think they're incongruous. I think that it makes perfect sense that it would be appropriated. And it's why a broader reproductive justice movement has to do more full-throated work to articulate those arguments. It's privacy and individual liberty, for that matter, barely scratch the surface. And we can have a conversation about equality and equal protection where that might have and should have and could fit into abortion-related jurisprudence, or maybe that's a conversation for another day. But the headline of my answer is no, I was never surprised to see that framing appropriated.
I'll just say briefly, when we think about kind of the main idea of this scene, which I thought the students did a phenomenal job of sharing with us, a right to choose. And I thought about how they not only amplified, the idea from the women's movement in the 1970s, but also how we think about it with the COVID pandemic, right? And thinking about vaccines. And so I guess one of the things that I thought about as I listened to them kind of gets at some of the deeper issues, right? And so when we think about the context of the 1970s, my body, my choice as a rallying cry, it wasn't just the issue of abortion. It was tied to other ways that women were systemically closed out, right? Economically, socially, politically. And so that was one example. And so I do think it's important for us to look at the systems and the structures that kept women from having the opportunities. And I think you all may remember, affirmative action, allowed women to have the right to apply for opportunities and other historically marginalized groups. And so I think when we have the conversation about the context of the 1970s and what it meant to say my body, my choice, and thinking about a right to choose, and we link it to the COVID pandemic and how we think about bodily autonomy, how we think about what systems are in place so that people can choose. And then for us, as institutional leaders, how do we create the kind of environment that's broad and inclusive enough so that we keep people safe, so that everyone, regardless of their decision, feels connected to the university community and other educational or other sectors who have tried to really grapple with these issues. And so I think as we have these conversations, we have to be nuanced in terms of how we think about the structures that exist, what it means for the different groups that are involved that are having these conversations. And I think there has to be a holistic praxis and lens as we engage and debate these issues and discuss them. If we're serious about really protecting and promoting what's best for the citizenry, that's has to be a priority.
These are hugely important points. I really appreciate them. I wanted to just add one perspective on this. And you may disagree, but there, even back in the 60s, and 50s, some states didn't allow women to take contraceptives. So it isn't just abortion, but in many respects, that kind of body autonomy doesn't have the broader potential impact on society. Like COVID might, for example, if you're not getting a vaccine, you are infecting other people who are then infecting other people, and it's a public health situation. In other words, you don't have autonomy in your body because if you have the disease anyway. And does that change in your mind any of the ways of thinking about body autonomy? Is it's kind of like, to me, you have a right to have a gun, but you don't have a right to shoot somebody with it. And if you want to accept the fact of having a very communicable disease that is killing thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, you are in fact killing people, right? And that's I don't know where that fits into the discussion around this, but it seems somehow different. Of course, people who are opposed to abortion are thinking of abortion as killing babies. So there's that aspect to it too. But the important point to me here is, to what extent do we have the right to do what we want to do? We want to be able to live our own life, get pizza, whatever, that's what's pointed out. But what if that causes harm to others? And then, how to, and I think some of the debate is around that, including in the abortion debate about killing babies, or certainly in the vaccine, if you're not getting vaccinated and affecting others, you can lead to sickness and death in other people.
Yeah, well, I would just add to you analogized a contraceptive from the start. And it's really important to note that in this country and in many states, it is more dangerous to give birth than it is to have an abortion, especially if you are a low-income woman, if you're a woman of color, if you're a rural woman. Yeah. So I just think that it's not all as cut and dried, perhaps, as that. And there are critical public health considerations for all of these analogies. I don't think any one of them is immune to it. So just want to put that out there.
Yeah, excellent point, because there are public health aspects to all of this. So, okay, great, thank you. So our final scene of the evening features 3 actors, and it's called Some Part of Who You Are.
This is the transcript of Peruse.
And this is the transcript of Queer, almost 40-something person.
And the transcript of Avery.
It was a summer day and I was in New York City, and I had I'd gone to the gym, and I had a gym bag with me, and I was wearing short shorts and a tank top. And I walked into this building near Columbus Circle, and there was a guard at the door. And people were going through the revolving door and going in. He specifically stopped me and asked to search my bag.
Oh, I mean, it's hard. It's hard to be like, oh, my rights are violated, right? Because thinking about being a queer kid growing up, right? I was just like, I don't have the right to get married if I wanted to, or I don't have the right to be out. I don't have the right to be out and be a teacher. I don't have the right to be, right? The person that I am through and through, I don't have the right to do that. Like, that's how I perceived that it was dangerous to be myself fully. And like, I could be fired. Now you're going to fire me because I'm a queer person? I mean, technically they can't, I don't think, because I was teaching in New Jersey at first. I don't think they could have. But when you're a teacher and someone doesn't like you, or someone takes offense to some part of who you are, you could easily be fired for any number of things. So there is like that concern.
The more problematic side of some of the social justice identity stuff, like, I work on a public university, right? Which is, there are laws around hiring and discrimination and all these other things. Also, there are people making big pushes for diversity and inclusion. So both of those things are very valuable. But then people will have very upfront conversations, like, we're hiring a new director for my department, and someone had interviewed, and I was talking to someone else about it, and they were very upfront about, oh, we don't want to hire him because he's a white man, and we don't want any white men in this department.
Yeah, and it was so out of place. It was so peculiar that there were 3 ladies who had gone through the revolving door in front of me, and they just stopped and watched the scene, agog. And so I was the only one who was searched. And then he looked through my gym bag and said, okay, you're okay. And then those ladies were still waiting there, with this look of empathy. And I approached them and I said, they really should hire guards that are more qualified. I mean, clearly I am gay. I don't have room in my bag for a bomb. They should know that.
And I had to grow up knowing that, and not like marriage wasn't an option, right? It's just not an option. And that was fine for me, because I fuck all this heteronormative insanity, and monogamy is insane to me. And in real life, it's always like someone cheats on someone else, and there's always this weird conflict, and no one can communicate openly.
And I realized I am the closest thing to a straight white man in this department. And I'm not even straight, because I'm the only white guy in the entire thing. And I know for a fact, because I've been on hiring committees, I know people that the only reason I got my job was because I put queer with a capital Q in my application letter. even though I resent doing that, and it's not even remotely relevant to the work that to anybody's work here. And it should be something, if that's something you want to share with people or becomes relevant, and as you become closer to colleagues, obviously talking about personal lives and stuff.
So, I mean, on a personal level, every once in a while that happens. I'm frequently searched at airports. The idea of the laws that have passed, the anti-LGBTQ laws that have passed in Texas and Florida are infringing on my rights. Possibility of women's reproductive rights being lost is important to me because I come from a country where my mother and my grandmother fought very hard for basic rights. For somebody in the position of being president of the United States to randomly announce that people from the Middle East can no longer travel to the United States, which affected some of my relatives who used to come to America on a regular basis, and then they couldn't because their passports were not accepted. And for him to randomly say, trans people cannot serve in the military anymore without consulting with anybody. I mean, these are all massive aggressions, just constantly have to watch and see what is happening and how I can adjust to the situation.
So I think that part of it is the world that had been structured as a kid growing up just clearly wasn't a good fit. And I know that I couldn't fully participate in that world. And so had to remove myself, and in some ways from the storyline. And I had to find acceptance in a different way. So my rights are violated in my identity, who I am, right? And yes, gay marriage, yay, but that can be taken away. Clearly they want to, right? How are we getting rid of abortion? How is that even a thing? And that's not the end. That's not the end, It's really not. So I am thankful for the changing consciousness, collective consciousness of our country, where, at least in a couple of states, I know that in parts of those states, I can be myself without fear of harassment and denial of service and, etc. But I know that is tenuous. And I know that is not consistent and a given.
But it was the fact that in service of being a more inclusive face, I think this is true of basically every college and also a lot of corporations now, you end up with this equally problematic mentality where I talked about this one candidate with a friend of mine in the department, and the first three things he said was race, gender, identity, and sexuality. That was the first three things that he was judging the candidate on, as opposed to any of the stuff this person prepared a half-hour presentation, has a doctorate and has all these research papers to their name. And that was the thing.
I can never be complacent because I simply don't have that kind of privilege. If I could, I probably would be complacent because I'm not a particularly political person. But in a free country, that's such a crock to say that, because you have to be political. It's expecting from the society to which you contribute to certain things that the society owes you. So you have to be political. But I would never run for political office. I just don't have, I'm just so emotional and thin-skinned, and I don't know. I don't know how to operate with corruption, you know? Don't know how to do it.
Wow. Once again, thank you for that really powerful performance, addressing so many of our contemporary issues that we're facing here at NYU, but really across the country. It was mentioned about colleges and corporations, and this issue of equal protection under the law. Do you think that equal protection under the law extends to affirmative action policies, and how do you think about that in terms of the 14th Amendment?
I appreciate that question, Jack. And I'm thinking about, and this came up through a couple of the presentations that we saw today, the ideas that we've been talking about with the 14th Amendment and equal protection. And, your question around how it ties in the idea of affirmative action. And a couple of things came to mind for me, and some of these are more philosophical, but then they also tie into kind of some of our policies and our practices, particularly as institutions or whether we're companies or corporations. And so when we say, when we think about the guise or the context of the 14th Amendment and equal protection and what that means and how that connects to making sure that opportunities are accessible. And this was one of the points I alluded to earlier about affirmative action and how it really kind of emerged in the 1970s was really because women and people of color during that time, as you all know, were not given the opportunity to even fill out an application, right? Weren't even provided access. I do also want to just highlight how the contemporary landscape that we're living in is something that we're having to kind of reconcile and grapple with because of the historicity of the Constitution, but also the historicity of inequality. And I'm saying it that way because we know that in many of our educational institutions, that in terms of women and they're having access to educational opportunities, many women were not allowed to attend colleges or universities. And so we have women's colleges. We know this is the case also for many historically Black colleges and institutions and tribal colleges. And so I loved how the students were able to kind of be very nuanced in talking about social identity, and the intersectionality around race, and it goes beyond, some of the traditional categories of race, gender, sexuality. But we see in the context that we're living in, how this plays out and who gets to decide, right? Who gets to decide how our desire or goals for equality will be achieved. But I think that we're really at a point now in society where we're grappling with kind of some of the historic cumulative effects of certain groups that have not been represented, whether they're women or other marginalized groups. And then we're also trying to grapple with some of the benchmarks and goals that educational institutions have or the corporate sphere may have in terms of lack of diversity in different ways. And are we providing the kind of access, rubrics, and metrics that allow us to pick the best candidates while being mindful of certain social identities and social locations or positionality that people come from? And I think we could probably spend days having this conversation. The last part that the student raised about corruption and how that also then fits into our practices, right? And one of the things we see in higher education is this mistrust, questions around lack of transparency. And it's not necessarily an accusation of corruption, but in other spheres, whether it's the business realm or the political realm, these ideas of corruption come up. And so there's a huge level of public mistrust around systems and how we operate. And so I think in terms of transparency, in terms of communication and practices, what the students have raised for us tonight is something that I hope we can continue to have a conversation around, because I feel like I have pages and pages more of things I'd love to say. And tonight really is just kind of the tipping point to kind of think about what are each of our individual responsibilities and duties, and how do we bring about collective action and collective change that really promotes the kind of equity and access that is really aspirational for us as an institution, for us as a country.
Mhm. Jennifer, did you want to add anything to this point, or?
Oh, I do. I know we're nearing the end of our hour, but I wanted to first just say that this medium was so extraordinary. The opportunity to sort of cull these conversations from these interviews and their presentations to us by the students, I think is going to have my mind reeling for a very, very long time. But I love that we also ended with the exchange about political engagement and what that looks like and what that can mean to all different people, that being political doesn't necessarily have to mean running for office, and what it means to speak out, and what it means to grapple with complacency. And I think that was a really important, well-textured, that interview was a really good way to actually get that point across. So I think that's a really great landing place for this entire conversation, which, while about the 14th Amendment and the Constitution for Constitution Day, is actually more fully about what it means to participate in our democracy writ large. And they ended us really well that way.
Yeah, no, I love that, Jennifer, the students saying, I can't be complacent, but, you know, I don't necessarily want to run for office, but I want to be engaged. And that's really, like you say, a great place to end. We all do need to be engaged politically, because as she says, everything is political, and we can do it in our own ways. Voting is obviously the most fundamental way and most important way that we can become engaged. And I'm glad the students brought that up. There were 3 questions in the chat. They're not easy questions. I just want to state what they are and see if anybody wants to answer those before we completely finish, because I want to take these out of from the audience. But one of the questions is, given the kind of erosion in civil rights laws that we are seeing currently and in the last few years, would it take a constitutional amendment to try to reverse that or protect those laws? And what might that look like? That was one question. A second question was, if the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, had passed, would all these bans on abortion and so on be simply unconstitutional? If that had passed, and how important would that have been for shaping the debate around these things? And then the third one was about, does the Constitution actually involve a right to vote for everybody? And is that in the Constitution? So those are big questions. I don't know if either of you wanted to pick on any of one of those, or any comment.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
I was going to jump in quickly on the Equal Rights Amendment, only to say that the ERA would provide a much broader toolbox to make the case for abortion rights using equality-based arguments with a constitutional amendment to bolster them. So it's it is a really important tool, and it ain't dead yet. It is absolutely worth continuing to press for full ratification. It has met its requirements, and there is a movement underfoot to see it fully through. So I would absolutely underscore the importance of the Equal Rights Amendment.
Good. Great.
Yeah. I'll just add quickly with regards to the question around the constitutional right to vote. And we know the 15th Amendment, I mentioned this earlier, gave those who were formerly enslaved the right to vote. And the actual language says that these individuals should not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so the last sketch for me really emphasized an important point that each of us have kind of highlighted, and many of these questions this evening lend itself to the importance of us realizing our responsibilities individually, but also it's a call to action for each of us. You know, we are living in the kind of environment and contemporary situation where we need to be active. And I hope tonight's conversation for all of our listeners who are tuning in and who join us, I think our performers did an outstanding job. And for me, this is a clarion call for us to be even more active and engaged. Every election matters, every opportunity to vote, whether it's for your school board or for the president of the United States. I think it's really important that we become more engaged and that we encourage structures and systems that allow that kind of civic engagement and voter engagement for all of us. That's what a democracy is supposed to be. And I think we have to do even more to make sure that we allow those processes, those systems, and those ways of being to be realized in the age that we're living in. So it's
Wow, I don't think that could be said any better. That was a terrific statement for us to end on. And I want to thank everyone for attending this evening's program, and thank you to the incredible performers who took part this year. They did just an amazing job. Thank you so much. And also to Dr. Karen Jackson Weaver, Jennifer Weiss-Wolf, and Joe Salvatore and team for making this event happen. We hope you enjoyed the performance and the discussion, which has been recorded and will be later uploaded to YouTube. And let me put in a special plug also for the support the efforts of NYU Votes. As you know, the midterm elections will be held this year on Tuesday, November 8th. NYU Votes seeks to ensure that all eligible voters in the NYU community are able to cast their vote either in person or by mail, and encourages all of you, as was just said, to become involved with the process, whether through volunteering, advocacy work, or other engagement opportunities. So let me turn it back to Joe. Please tell us about your upcoming events in October, as you mentioned, that are connected to tonight's program. Thanks again, everyone.
Great, thanks, Dean Knott. Our upcoming performance is called Whatever You Are, Be a Good One, a Portraits U.S. Town Hall. And it'll bring together 50 voices from interviews collected across the geographical United States and political affiliations about polarization. At each performance, a randomized selection of those interviews will be performed by the actors you saw this evening. Are we as divided as the media would like us to believe? Can our geographical location predict what our politics are? Is there more that connects us than separates us? We invite you to come engage, dialogue, and witness with us in this theatrical experience where you might be surprised by what you discover about yourself and this continuing experiment that we call the United States of America. Whatever You Are, Be a Good One opens on Thursday, October 20th and runs through Sunday, October 30th. 4 of our performances will also be broadcast live so that folks from across the country and the world can participate. We hope you'll join us in whatever format works best for you. For more information, visit steinhardt.nyu.edu Verbatim Performance Lab. Again, I'd like to thank Dean Jack Knott, Dr. Karen Jackson Weaver, and Jennifer Weiss-Wolf for the great discussion this evening, and the VPL actors and team for their great work, and our colleagues at NYU TV for hosting us here in the studio and making this live broadcast a reality. And again, thanks to the John Brademas Center, the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network at NYU Law, and NYU Votes for sponsoring this Constitution Day celebration. And thanks to all of you for attending. We really appreciate your support, and we hope you have a great rest of your evening and hope to see you in October. Good night.